groovy cool man that you all came to hang out here today. Yes, I am dressed. This is not original, although I did have things that look very similar to this. I also had bell-bottom pants, and I had what we call smock tops, and my mother and her cohorts, my friends' moms, struggled with because they thought we looked like we were dressing in maternity clothes. For those of you that grew up in this era of 1950 to 1980, you have some frame of reference for what I speak of this morning. But I am glad, and I enjoyed so much last week getting to hear about those who had experiences from the 1920s up until 1950. Today we will look at 1950 through 1980. Many of you are aware that there is a generation called the baby boomers, and that is because there was, let's think on this a moment, a boom of babies following World War II. Excuse me, and that runs from 1946 to 1964 by most people's accounts. They are the framework to qualify as a baby boomer. So 14 of the years we'll look at this morning in our 30-year span have baby boomers in it, and because of the demographic of this congregation particularly, but just kind of our world, there's a lot of baby boomers still around. We will talk next week about the generation that's actually getting more numerous, and it is more numerous than the baby boomers, but we'll get to that next week. But for a long time, baby boomers were the largest group of people because of this whole just explosion of births following the Second World War. So this morning, I hope we will hear from several of the baby boomers in our midst. There we go. Mist wouldn't be bad either if you've been outside much this week. But this morning, we're going to look at a text that's written in the second chapter of Acts. So this is from the 1st century A.D. However, it is written about the early church and how they were conducting themselves. But for those of you that may be familiar with this 1950 to 1980, this sounds a lot like some of those communes that formed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so we look at this text, again, written in the 1st century, but there are a few exceptions, notable exceptions to some of those communes of the 1960s, but it says all the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. Now that's not again, I was a little young, I certainly was not a part, I was not a part of a commune. It wasn't commune, it was commune, how I grew up in South Hill. They've gone and joined a commune. And so anyway, I don't think they were experiencing the Lord's Supper or listening to the apostles' teaching or praying, but they may have been praying. I don't know what they were doing. I wasn't there. But I do know that many times rock music and drugs that you do not buy in the drugstore were available. So this, though, is the early church, and it says a deep sense of awe came over them all, and the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. And all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. Now that did go on in the 1960s. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity, all the while praising God and enjoying the goodwill of all the people. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. Now again, the early church has this phenomenon going on around Christianity. However, like I said, there was a sense of collaboration of a generation, and again, I'm trying hard not to have favorites by any means, but this is my generation. I was born in 1960, so I'm not in the middle, the flat middle of it, but my growing up years are the last 2 decades of the section of time we're looking at this morning, and so it's impossible. That is my story. And so I obviously know it differently. It's not something I've heard, it's not hearsay, and it's not something that I've experienced like I will 1980 to 2010 and been there, but wasn't growing up. I've seen all those years as an adult. And so this morning, it's hard not to remember parts of this much better. I couldn't remember 1920 to 1950. I wasn't there. And so this morning, I'm going to try to help us see, but it's all going to have to come through my filter in some ways, which is why we're now turning to you guys. And I want you, who did grow up between 1950 and 1980, to share with us what Christianity, and again, I remind us that this is not necessarily the church. There's nothing wrong with sharing what was going on in the church. But for those that may not have been in the church in those years, but were here on the earth in those years, I don't want you to feel like you can't speak. Because whether you were worshiping in a church or not, Christianity was still in America, thanks be to God. And we'd love to hear your input on what your perception of Christian faith was even when you were growing up. So, I'm not going to call people out, but I do know some of you were born in this time frame. Because I know generally how old you are.
Well, I'll help you out.
Thank you.
I was born in '46, so I didn't qualify. However, it was that time in our growing up, both Dix and myself, that we lived on the West Coast, and there was a lot going on with the hippies and the whatever you want to call the movement at that time, and people were going to San Francisco. That was, I think, the big theme zone. We're going to San Francisco. And it all looked very kind of whimsical, and you're the right age that, oh, to be free and do whatever you want. But for me, I thought it was a bit on the irresponsible and not taking responsibility for your own life, and what were you supposed to do? Just sit around and sing and grow peaches and go to the country and all that. So it looked intriguing, but it didn't look safe to me at all. And at the same time, kind of that era, my father was interested in the New Thought movement, and like Norman Vincent Peale, not really off the wall, started by what the Marble Collegiate Church in New York. And it was very much positive thinking and Christ mind and all that. So luckily for me, I don't think I'd have gone to San Francisco. But that replaced for me, something really positive and strong in the Christian movement, the mindset, and what Christ had to offer.
Cool. It wasn't because of my point of view. I say that in 2017 anyway. Oh, anyone else? Yes, Teresa.
I can remember, women pastors in churches growing up. I can remember going to school, starting meeting for prayer. And they used to hand out New Testament Bibles. I brought mine today.
Oh, the Gideon ones?
And it's dated December 20th, 1977. This was the only Bible I had until I was an adult.
Do you remember by any chance generally what grade you were in when you got that, when they brought it to the school? When you got yours at the school?
Fourth or fifth.
This is a good time. I wanted to remind you, there's a bulletin insert for our sermon notes, which you usually fill in. These 3 weeks, we are doing a list of the U.S. presidents during that time frame. And then just, again, I'm having to very much handpick a few significant events. It's 30 years of history, so just bear with me, because I'm sure there are things we missed. But one of the notable things are two rulings that things were unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In 1954, the racial segregation of public schools were deemed unconstitutional, okay? And then in 1962 and 63, there were two decisions, and they kind of got decided, the best I could read up, pretty much together. And that said that school-sponsored Bible study and prayer were unconstitutional. And yet what's interesting, and this is actually true to this day, but 1977, you were able to receive a New Testament.
They would have allowed, I guess, and I'd be surprised if that's not Gideon's, because that's who used to do those little Bibles, that they would have allowed that to come to the school, but the school couldn't go out and buy Bibles, could not have, under the constitutional ruling, been able to go out and buy Bibles and pass them out, or New Testaments and pass them out in the church, in the schools, to the children. But I will be honest, I didn't realize it was even that early. I thought it was a little later that prayer gets challenged in the school system, but it was not. It was the early 1960s. So.
And I remember the blue law on Sunday.
That's in the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia. Did y'all have blue
Yep.
laws in the
Oh,
Northwest?
yes.
It started at Saturday at noon. After that, they covered up all the things, and you could be in the grocery store, but you could not buy meat
Could not buy meat.
on Saturday, or you could do, but in Sunday, I think they were still closed, but, they started Saturday afternoon, no meat. But I don't think beer or wine was available in our grocery stores anyway.
Well, anyway, so you're right, the blue laws were in effect. If you don't know what the blue laws were, it was that businesses were closed on Sunday. They were not allowed to sell things on Sunday. And I know the drugstore would be open, but only the section of like over-the-counter drugs were available. You could go in so that you could buy things if you needed the medicine, but you couldn't buy like the school supplies, like the aisle that had the pencils and paper and things like that. So there would be sections of the drugstore in South Hill that were off limits on Sunday. You couldn't go and buy things that were not essential, but they did have the store open. But drugstores were the only things open for us. Others? Yes, Gwen.
I don't want to be too lengthy, but I guess my childhood, we grew up in the Episcopal church and Episcopal school, where I went to chapel every day. Volunteerism was stressed. It was required. And also in chapel, I can remember in the 60s, talking about integrating the schools and what we as a school in a Christian life would do, that we would integrate.
Good for you.
And
Yes, you would.
we would. Yes, we would. We would not be segregated. Of course, I don't know, it was not a time when all our kids could come to the private schools. But politics were discussed at that time, maybe because it was the 60s. And then on the weekends, I grew up here, coming to church with my grandmother and my parents. And I think about the choir that I was in, when we had a youth choir, probably 12 to 15 kids, and all baby boomers. We had NYF on the weekends. It was our social life. We had a coffee house in the parsonage. So that coffee house was very much the 60s and the 70s. And of course, there was no alcohol, but we had some interesting drinks. And we had music playing, folk music and singing. And something that I remember as a child that I loved was revival. And we had revival here. And we had no air conditioning. Of course, I guess I didn't care when I was 12, 13, 14. But it was a time when the singing and the music was a very important thing. And we would all come in the evening. And it was part of my social life, So I have really wonderful memories.
Absolutely.
Most of us know where we were when we heard that John Kennedy was assassinated. I'll never forget my science class in ninth grade.
Are y'all hearing her okay?
No.
Yes or no?
Most of us
Okay,
will remember
right.
where we were when John Kennedy was assassinated. That's another thing that we've had, that other generations read about, but they don't really, can't even think about how emotional it was. I remember they called us all to the gym at Patrick Henry, and we were all put on buses and allowed to come home that day after the announcement was made, and to watch it on television, throughout the next day or so. But I was in the ninth grade in Mrs. Garvey's science class, and it will always stick in my mind.
Yes, Jerry.
I think it was 69, I think it was the MYF went to the retreat that the Methodist Church had in North Carolina up in Cherokee. Do you still have that thing?
Oh, up at Lake Junaluska, maybe?
Yeah, that's what it was, on Tennessee line.
They don't, I mean, in other words, they certainly do gatherings there still. Lake Junaluska is still there, still owned by the southeast jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church, and has many, many events that go on. Yes.
There's a bunch of us out there in 69, right in my house.
That is wonderful. Yes, Kathy.
When we grew up, during the summer, we spent the entire summer going to all kinds of different vacation mountains.
Oh.
I mean, that was the thing. And they would be for like a week or 2 weeks, and that's how you spent your summer. And I can remember over the south side, still the truth is I passed down, vacation Bible school there. And that was what we did during the summer. We studied those different vacation Bible school. Different denominations, we all did that.
I think that's still quite common in Northern Virginia because there's a lot of churches and they're easy to get to, and they just go from one to another experiencing.
Anyone else? Yes, Jim.
Obviously, I wasn't born in that era,
But you were growing up in that era, weren't
I
you?
grew up in that era,
Yeah.
and the church part didn't really start until the 50s, and I'm a colony younger. We lived in Washington at that time. Excuse me. When we moved to California, my parents chose the Episcopal Church, which was different with my father Wilson, I always remember him. I became an acolyte for about 6, 7 years of doing that. And also the youth group was, I was involved with the Episcopal Church. And I think Father Wilson retired, as I recall. And then my parents decided that we would go to the Lutheran Church, which was probably not that far from our house. But anyway, so there was a little bit of change. And then there was a happening in my life that my parents decided that I would go to California Lutheran College, my first year of college. And that was an experience because we had chapel every day. And it was a little bit different, and I was there. I happened to be what they call a principal's son. My dad was a junior high principal, but we had a lot of pastors' kids, PKs, as we call them, at Cal Lutheran. And it was a different influence to talk to those kids and different things we did, but it was definitely different. And then ended up, well, actually, Carolyn and I, when we lived in Fairfax, we went to a Methodist church in Centerville.
Oh, okay.
Loved that guy. Very beautiful, but always had roots around us.
Anyone else?
Well, one thing about growing up during that time, we had reading of the Bible in school every day. Emian Smith was the teacher and principal of Beaver Dam School and member of Beaver Dam Church. And she read a Bible story, and we did pray every day in school. And
And
that was...
forgive me for not standing here and doing it in my head, but you were there long after 1963. No, you were not. Would that have been after 1963 when they ruled it unconstitutional? Because I'm not sure.
I was not.
Okay.
At Beaver Dam in 63.
Right. The reason I bring that up, Peggy Mae Morris, that many of you know that worships at Beaver Dam, shared last week that her mother, Winnie, was a school teacher. Gwen, do you know if it was elementary, or Martha, do you know? That's what I thought. I thought it was elementary age. But anyway, when they said you can't be praying in school, Winnie Hall said, well, I'm still going to pray. And Peggy, who was an adult, well into adulthood by that point, said, Mama, you can't be doing that. That's illegal now. You can't. She said, as long as I'm in the classroom, I'm going to pray. And she retired from education, still praying, and no one turned her in. No one pushed against it, which is what it would take. In other words, if people, and there are still, I feel, certain little pockets of holdouts that say, till somebody reports me, and if they do, then I'll decide if I'm leaving or if I'm going to stop. But for now, I'm going to pray. But that is a major, definitive moment, though, because I don't remember Bible reading or prayer in school. Now, it could have been my first, second grade, but now it would have been in first and second grade in 1966 to 1968. So it may have been done, and I just don't remember, you know, I was a little young and just don't remember it. I know by the time I got a little bit up, you know, to really pay attention that it was not done until I went into private school, and then we did. Now, we didn't pray the Lord's Prayer even then, because I think some of you grew up, somebody said last week, Jack said he learned the Lord's Prayer praying it at school, praying in public schools. So, yes, Roxy.
Well, no, also the pledge to the flag. That was so important, and what they have done, they've taken away God and country from the schools. This is terrible, and I don't know why nobody else sees it. It's awful.
They still pledge.
Yeah.
I thought I mean, the schools I knew of do the Pledge of Allegiance and have a moment of silence. Most of them, I think, now have a moment of silence in which you can choose if you want to pray,
Same with the pledge, you don't have to say it, but they're gonna say it.
Right, okay, they do say it, it's just that you don't have to participate. You're not going to be forced to participate. Yes, Jerry?
Like, Danny, if you miss a hand, you go to the principal's office and get a whipping name.
It's a personal account.
I'm talking about that.
I won't say who, but somebody just said, that sounds like a personal account. So we've got, in that list of things, though, and again, we can't pick everything, but you see this shifting. You see America goes through the assassination of John F. Kennedy. His brother gets assassinated in the late 1960s. Martin Luther King is assassinated. I mean, there were no figures of high prominence that were losing their lives at other people's hands. And then in the early 70s, you have the Watergate scandal. So there's a lot politically going on. The Vietnam War is being fought and being, again, this is all my understanding from history, being really pushed back against, which was almost polar opposite to how America had pulled together in World War II. Now again, some of you were there in World War II and maybe can correct me if I'm wrong. So there's this shift, there's some major societal shifts going on though, in the time period we're talking about today that we still are talking about, like prayer in school. You know what I mean? Like how we, can read what we can and can't do. And I'll tell you, having raised two daughters in Hanover County Public Schools up till, 2 years ago, it's still an ongoing debate within the schools. And when I say debate, people are leery. They don't know what they can do and what they can't. And they're always wanting to do things, but tedious and tenuous about overstepping any boundaries because they don't want to lose what privilege they do have as part of it. So it's just, it created an environment in which we still, in 2000s, early 2000s, are leery of exactly where do those lines, what are the lines got blurred. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. So, anybody else?
We talked about World War II and how it's so different from the way things are accepted now. Even the children in elementary school went out and collected tinfoil off of cigarette packs, newspapers, rubber bands, anything, and took them to the school for the war effort. And, we didn't ask, what are you doing with them? We just were told that you're helping the war effort, so do this. So we were out pulling apart cigarette packs, and I can remember doing this as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old. It was really, but we were helping the effort, so everything was good. We had little tokens to buy food with at the grocery store and to buy shoes with. I had forgotten that. But they had little red ones and little blue ones. And you bought different things with the color token, and you had, things were rationed. You couldn't buy sugar. You could only buy so much meat. At one point, there were no potatoes. And being an Irish family, with no potatoes, what do you do? So we were eating rice, which none of us liked. But we ate it anyway. But there were just many things that were so different then that are, that we do now.
Anyone else? I've shared many, and there are tremendous amount of positive stories of Christianity in America in my life, but I'm going to share with y'all a segment of my growing up experience with Christianity, and with a point, because I think it has a point for where we go. The fall that I was 8 years old, would have been 1968, I am in the beginning of 3rd grade, and I remember some of this, and then I this week looked up, finally, with Google, found a document of an article on this subject, and one part of it I had forgotten, but most of it I remembered, but I have been fascinated myself because I remembered through an 8-year-old's eyes, and my parents didn't discuss these things in front of us much at all. If I didn't witness it, first, and, like front and center, because they couldn't keep me from having seen it, they didn't sit us down and tell us these things. I think that was to help us stay more innocent, and in many ways I appreciate that. That's not a criticism. That's a credit to them in a way that I wasn't, at 8 years old trying to figure these things out that are hard to understand as an adult. But anyway, that fall, come to find out, I knew it had probably something to do with it, but at that point, Mecklenburg County, where I was growing up, was embroiled, as was much of the state of Virginia, in racial integration, segregation in the public schools. And so 4 clergy in the South Hill area got together and they decided to do a Thanksgiving service, joint Thanksgiving service, and those 4 reached out to the Catholic Church and invited them to also come. The other 4 were Protestant. I believe Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, and Baptist. In fact, I know that's right. And they invited the Catholics. So I'm thinking, was it over the Catholicism Protestant thing? But no, because that didn't seem to ring true, because I never experienced it that much. The Catholic Church in South Hill had 1 African American or black member. All of the other 4 churches were exclusively white. They were all Caucasian congregations. So when that happened, the Episcopal Church pastor, rector, and our United Methodist pastor began to receive anonymous notes, threatening notes. But what happened the closer it got to Thanksgiving and that service, the Episcopal Church, they proved was arson, was caught on fire, and burned to the point that it was not usable. 2 weeks later, the parsonage of the United Methodist, or the Methodist, it wasn't quite United, it just turned United Methodist, that was caught on fire. There was some damage, but it didn't burn the parsonage down. They caught it in time and were able to put it out. They pushed on to do the service and even went on the radio and said, we are still having the service. We are not going to let this deter us. They had the Thanksgiving service on Wednesday night, and my dad was the head usher at South Hill United Methodist. Now again, I don't know I'd forgotten about the fire. I remember the parsonage catching on fire. I remember the back of the Episcopal Church. But I didn't understand it was motivated politically. You see what I'm saying? Or very possibly. I certainly didn't know these clergy had gotten together and planned to have this Thanksgiving service. But there were almost 500 people, which is a lot of people for Little South Hill, showed up for that Thanksgiving service. But my dad, as head usher, because it was done Wednesday night, came home that night. He was one of the last 2 to lock up the church. We had come on home, and when Dad came in, he said that they got ready to close down the church, and they had locked all the doors, and they began to hear something in another part of the church, and they saw a person from the back in the dark run out of the sanctuary and down through the Sunday school classes, and they ended up going through the hallway and out the window of the classroom that I had been in 1st grade Sunday school. All the little children's classes were lined up, in a long hallway, and they went out of that window, and by the time they got down there, the window was open, the person was gone, and they had escaped. So Dad comes home. Well, from that moment until well into my adult life, I didn't like to be in a church by myself. I just did anything I could to avoid ever being at a church by myself. But every now and again I would be forced to, or for some reason find myself there. But literally, I was married and doing books for the Baptist church across the street. I would go I'd go in the door closest to my office to do that and lock myself in there because I received a note that said, you need to go look at your, an anonymous note, you need to go look at your pastor's study. He took himself, the other clergy, and a state policeman. And when they opened the door, the curtains had been torn, paint thrown on the walls, all the books on his shelf thrown on the floor. And so I share all this to say that went on, it got calmed down, and that following March, I was confirmed. At 9 years old, the 29th of March, 1969, so 3-4 months after this happens, I am confirmed. Now, I don't put all this together as an adult. I didn't put all of this together to this week or last couple of weeks of thinking about this sermon and this week that I lived. And the reason I share this, though, is I look back because while all that was going on, and it was, I'm sure, a very difficult time in the life of our church, it was tumultuous. You have people breaking in the church. You have them desecrating sacred places. Little Claudia Jean Holmes is still getting confirmed, being mistakenly rebaptized, but that's a story for another day. But I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, God knew then that I'd be standing here, that God would call me to ministry. So I say that to say this. Right now, the church is pushed back against. There's all kinds of things going on within the church. But let's not lose sight that even when stuff like that's going on, God is still at work. He certainly was in my life. You know, none of that kept me from coming to faith. None of that kept them. The other thing is, I don't remember a single Sunday. The Episcopals did have to go somewhere else to worship because they lost their building. You know, they could not worship in it. But they went somewhere else. I don't think there was a single Sunday that they just closed down the church doors and said, we're not meeting anymore because people keep breaking in. They just kept having church. They kept doing Sunday school. They kept on proclaiming the Word of God, singing God's praises, and working on these societal issues as they did so. So I share that. Again, that is more of a negative experience, but it happened. But it's not the all of my experience by any means. And so I find great comfort that God that was with me in 1969 and all of them in 1969 is still with us. Now, it's a lot better not to have those tumultuous times, but even in the midst, God can do work. Amen.
Amen.